Well, why don't we make a start? Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the 17th lecture in this two-year series on history and philosophy of science and 20 objects. We're now at the last leg of the journey. In the last lecture, but one, on the Bar and Shrewd rangefinder, we looked at one perspective on the relationship between science and technology. And the emphasis there was on technology as applied science. And we looked in particular at some puzzles around the relationship between, on the one side, technological success, and on the other side, what you might call theoretical success. The historian Peter Deere has even said that one signature of modern science from the early modern period on, the period of the scientific revolution forward, has been what he's called the truth-utility circle. So we're confronted by some amazing piece of technology, and we ask, why is it so useful? And the answer comes back, it's so useful because it's based on a true theory. You say, but how do I know whether this theory is true? And the answer comes back, well, if it weren't true, we wouldn't have a technology that works so well. So that was one perspective on the relationship between science and technology. This evening, we're going to explore a different perspective, also relating those two, science and technology, but now looking at the role of technology in the communication of science. And even more generally, the role of communication in science and how overlooked that sometimes is. Our object, or rather set of objects this evening, come from a Victorian printing press, which is part of a working Victorian print group here on the campus. We couldn't bring the whole thing here, but we brought representative samples of it. Our lecturers are Dr. Jonathan Topham, Senior Lecturer in History and Philosophy of Science, and Konstantin Kiprijanov, a graduate student in History and Philosophy of Science. So please join me now in welcoming Konstantin and Jonathan.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay. Just tell me if I'm being too loud. Okay, so yeah, thank you. I will begin our lecture actually by giving you a very brief overview of what kind of objects we have here, because it's obviously more than one object, and it's, as Greg said, all part of the equipment of the printing room. So yeah, they're on display here, but also we've got a few slides. So I will just tell you a little bit about how those objects came to Leeds and what kind of life they've lived here. But first of all, let me show what there actually is. So you can see this is a case of type, of lead type, and I'm wearing this glass because I'm going to touch it, and I don't want to get lead poisoning, so yeah. And those are like little pieces of, lead, and John will then explain how they're actually used to print stuff. The font of this piece of type, or of this kit of type, is Gill, and the size is 8 point. And we chose the Gill type because there is a local connection here between Gill and the University of Leeds. So you might have seen the War Memorial outside the lecture theatre, the big relief. That is made by Eric Gill, and he's also the designer of this kind of type. And it was told recently this is the hipster type now, so it's even better we have it. Yeah. Okay, and then we have obviously a so-called composing stick, which is that one. We also have a form, which is a metal frame, basically, where the set type is fixed before it goes into the press. And we have also a mallet and a woodblock. And John will explain later how the things are used. So the woodblock is about that size. And obviously there is also the press, but we could not bring the press because it's really heavy and it's made of iron. Yes, so that press is in the printing room. And that press is from 1857. It's called the Albion press. And these kind of presses, they came in different sizes basically. They were made between 1820 up until 1930, and they were used for different purposes. But basically after the arrival of the steam press, those hand presses were used by individual printmakers and basically artists and private presses. And yes, we happen to have one of those. So those objects basically live in the print room. And The print room is a printing workshop which was established in 1963 by the School of English when they purchased the first press, which was this Albion press. And then those different types, those different pieces of equipment were used in teaching between 1971 and 1981, actually as a fixed thing in the on the module. And let me look that one up. Bibliography and textual criticism. And today, this equipment is still used in postgraduate teaching by our school, but also by the School of English. So, using the objects that I just have described, John is now going to explain how, this kind of equipment was used to make prints or to print stuff using the hand press. So, over to you.
Thank you very much, Konstantin. And as Konstantin has obviously introduced our object and the associated paraphernalia, so the object is 1857 Albion Press from our print workshop. But before we go any further, it's obviously important to explore a bit further the object in relation to its use. So I'll just take a few minutes to introduce you to the historic process of printing, how a printing press like this was used, and to talk about the process of printing and the associated equipment, how it changed at the start of the 19th century. And then we'll turn in the second and third parts of the lecture to the question of the surprising role, as we build it, that this equipment played in the development of the modern sciences, both on a grand scale and in relation to the nuts and bolts. So, without further ado, as many of you will know, the story of printing using movable type, in Europe at least, goes back to around 1440, and the Strasbourg goldsmith Johannes Gutenberg, and it involved the assemblage of these tiny little individual pieces of lead-based type into a form for relief printing using oil-based ink. Individual pieces of type were manufactured laboriously using molds or matrices. The molten type was poured into the molds in pretty intolerable working conditions, in fact. And it was only in the later part of the 19th century that casting and composing machinery began to become significant. So I mentioned composing. That was the next stage of the process. Composing type was making the individual pieces of type up into texts that could be printed. That again was very labour intensive. The compositor stood in front of the cases of type, the upper case, which surprisingly enough had the large letters, and the lower case, which had the small letters. And the compositor would select individual pieces of type to put into the composing stick, of course, upside down. There's our composing stick and an 18th century picture of a composing stick and the type going in upside down. Of course, the lines had to be justified using separate spacing type of different sizes. A good compositor might manage around 1,000 N's per hour. What is an N, you ask? An N is a linear measurement of type equivalent to the size of a letter N. So 1,000 N's per hour. Pretty slow work. And if you have a go yourself, you'll find that you can't get anywhere near 1,000 N's per hour. Once the stick was full, the compositor transferred the type to the galley, a long tray which could be used to produce a proof in order to check that the type was set appropriately. By the time we get to the 19th century, you could do that on a galley press like this one, which is down in our print workshop. Any mistakes, of course, then had to be corrected before the pages could be made up. And indeed, once ready, the type had to be set out as pages. And this was done using an imposing stone or some flat surface. The set type was put into a metal form And we've got one here that you can have a look at. It's got a setting of type of one of Shakespeare's sonnets, which I was involved in printing for a special commemoration of the Shakespeare anniversary recently. You have to use furniture to pack it out appropriately. Furniture are these bits of wood which appear in between the bits of type, and there's our wonderful stock of furniture down in the print workshop. Once the type was made up into pages, then you might again take a proof, this time a page proof. And again, you might find some errors which would have laboriously to be corrected before you went to press. Now, what did going to press mean? Well, the common press, just before we get to that, I should say that when you made up your pages, you had to do so according to an appropriate scheme of imposition. It was very rare that a printed sheet only had one page on it. It would commonly have lots of pages, and then you would fold the printed sheet to make your book. So then, as you laid out your type ready to print, it would have to be in one of these various imposition schemes. Then you would use your press to actually do the imposing, to do the press work. The common press of Gutenberg, that's the one here on your left, I guess, continued in much the same form from the 15th century to the end of the 18th. And in fact, once iron presses came in the 19th century, this is our Albion, one of our Albion presses, they looked actually pretty much the same. But Gutenberg's press was made of wood. It involved a carriage assembly onto which the type and paper were placed, which was run beneath the platen. So here's your type assembly, your paper goes in here, and it is run under the platen there. And once it's under the platen, you lower the platen to make an impression. This was a two-person task. You got two pressmen working, one pulling and one beating. So the form is placed here, and the beater is busy applying the ink using ink balls. That's the beating. While the puller is securing the paper on the tin pan with the frisket, which is then lowered down onto the type. The type assembly is run under the platen. The puller then pulls, that is, brings the platen down to make an impression. Meanwhile, he's doing that here. Meanwhile, the beater is busy getting more ink on the ink balls for the next go. And this was a pretty laborious process, but these guys could manage to do as many as 4 impressions am I getting this right? 4 impressions a minute, that's right. They could manage to do 4 impressions a minute, or about 250 impressions an hour, which is pretty staggering actually, given how complex it is. Of course, they've only now printed one side of the sheet. The sheet has to be perfected. So once the ink is dry, they'll do the other side, making sure that the pages match up on the 2 sides. Okay, that was the printing process pretty much from the 15th century through to the end of the 18th century. But in the half century between about 1790 and 1840, not only printing, but one after another of the core book manufacturing processes underwent transformation, underwent mechanisation, to be precise. The changes were arguably as radical as the inception of movable type printing had been in the 15th century. And we'll explore today how they had significant implications for the making of the modern sciences. So the first change, just quickly, in regard to the printing process itself, was the introduction of an iron press that was more efficient. There we are, there's the one. And This was, the first one was devised in the years after 1800 by, under the patronage of Earl Stanhope, so hence the Stanhope Press. But numerous such presses were soon being made. And the advantage of using iron was that you could, with your larger platen size, have an increased capacity. You could get the work done more rapidly. But much more consequential was the devising of machine presses that were powered by steam. The first of these was in operation on the Times by 1814. It was a cylinder press, and it soon had a perfector, which meant that it could print both sides, and you could get 900 large perfected sheets printed in the space of an hour. So that was 6 times the rate that you could hope for with the old manual iron hand press. And these machines became increasingly complex, and they were increasingly widely used in the following decades. But while the mechanisation of printing was important, it wasn't the only aspect of book production to be mechanised. Composition continued to be done by hand until well on in the 19th century, but from the 1820s, you could use stereotyping to avoid having to recompose some type when you wanted to reprint the same text. And with stereotyping, you used plaster of Paris or later papier-mâché to produce a cast from the set type so that you could produce a solid plate to keep for future use. Paper had been manufactured by hand from linen rags since the early 12th century, but at the end of the 18th century it began to be manufactured by machinery. The paper-making machine invented in Paris by Nicolas Louis Robert in the 1790s was developed in Britain by the wholesale stationers Henry and Seeley Fourdrinier in the 1800s. And as the demand for paper went up and up, the new machinery helped to keep the costs even, though it was still pretty costly to use paper. Also starting in the 1820s, binding became an industrial process. Instead of books being bound in leather in a bespoke fashion, that's what's going on here in the 18th century, publishers began to use prefabricated cases which could be applied to the volume that was stitched up. Taken all together, these various changes had a profound impact on the manufacture of books, and the appearance of the finished object it was also very different, as anyone who has ever handled a book from before about 1800 will know. Okay, so we've got ourselves up to speed a bit about what all this kit was for. But I hear you say, this is all very interesting, but why have you bothered to give us a lecture, one of your 20 lectures on the history and philosophy of science in 20 objects, on the Victorian printing press? In what way did it have this supposed surprising role in the making of the modern sciences? Well, in the remaining 2 parts of the lecture, we're going to explore those questions. First, on a grand scale, and then on a rather more minute, as I've called it here, nuts and boltsy kind of a way. So, we might justify the inclusion of a printing press in a series of lectures on history and philosophy of science in 20 objects on the grounds that it's a profoundly important object in the history of technology. Indeed, numerous volumes have been written about the impact of the inception of movable type printing on human culture and society. But as we're going to see, there are particular reasons why this technology has been important to the history of science. Oops, I'm going backwards. Perhaps the most famous work on the inception of movable type printing is the 1979 work, The Printing Press as an agent of change by the late Elizabeth Eisenstein. One of the central claims of Eisenstein's monumental work was that the printing press facilitated the wider diffusion of texts than had been the case with manuscripts, thereby fostering public debate and private study and contributing to both the Reformation and the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries. So immediately we find ourselves in a technological story that goes to the heart of the history of science. In addition, however, Eisenstein claimed that the printing press led to the achievement of a more reliable preservation and standardization of knowledge, because multiple copies of a text could be made mechanically from the same setting of type. Such fixity, Eisenstein suggests, fostered a new culture of truth in which claims could be compared to a common standard, something that again goes to the heart of the history of science. But while we clearly have a technology of importance to historians of science, Eisenstein's account has proved controversial. Indeed, science historian Adrian Johns, in his 1998 book, The Nature of the Book, argued that for all that one might expect the new technology to have introduced fixity, it did nothing of the kind. Just like manuscripts, printed objects continued to be riotously uncontrollable in early modern culture, with pirates and plagiarists and writers of abstracts or summaries and others as well, all making the author's meaning anything except stable. What made for the stabilization of meaning and a culture of truth were the social conventions that only gradually built up around the new technology. And this, of course, is a key point in the history of technology. While new technologies may have far-reaching consequences, their effects are far from determinate. Humans are endlessly creative in the way that they respond to technologies, and their social and cultural consequences are strikingly different in different circumstances. Nevertheless, in the invention of printing, we have a historical technology of real importance, not only in human history generally, but for the history of science in particular. So much for the invention of printing, but what about our Victorian printing press and its surprising role in the making of modern science? Well, we've just seen that the start of the 19th century witnessed a second radical innovation in printing. Its mechanisation and the mechanisation of allied book trays. That transformation involved a fundamental shift in the conditions under which communication could take place. Indeed, science historian James Secord calls it the greatest transformation in human communication since the Renaissance. And perhaps because of the transformation of communication in our own age, science historians are ever more aware of the important role that communication plays in the making of knowledge. When, back in the 1930s, Polish microbiologist Ludwik Fleck asked himself how scientific facts came to be made, he concluded that quite as important as what went on in the laboratory was what went on outside of it. Knowledge claims, he concluded, only took on their fact-like characteristics when they were stripped of caveats and complexity in order to communicate them to wider audiences. Specialists in other scientific fields, for instance, or students, or the general public. Yet it's precisely such publications that help to induct new members into the scientific community, to inculcate them in a style of thought that's shared by the community. So in this way, the processes of communication take centre stage in the way that the sciences work, and that a generation of science historians are now built on such insights, paying closer attention to the role of communication in science. So, how does this general point relate to our story about 19th century printing presses? Why did the mechanisation of the book trade matter in the making of modern science? Well, the bottom line, oh, we're not ready to go there yet. The bottom line was the bottom line. The mechanisation of book trade made it possible to produce printed items vastly more cheaply. So it made it possible to produce new kinds of printed objects altogether more easily, circulating them to wider audiences than had previously been possible. And this development of new kinds of publication changed the manner in which scientific knowledge was communicated. And I'm going to run briefly through 3 examples of this. First of all, scientific journals. Secondly, scientific school books. And thirdly, popular science publications. The focus in these comments will be on Britain, but you could find similar examples from other countries, especially France and Germany. But during these years, Britain was prominent in developments, both in the book trade and in the sciences. So it's not mere parochialism, to use the British examples here. So, first, scientific journals. The history of scientific journals is a somewhat vexed topic. On the one hand, there are plenty of people who will like to tell you that the oldest scientific journal in the world is the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, commenced in 1665. But neither the Philosophical Transactions, nor in fact the many commercial periodicals produced in the first half of the 19th century look very much like or clearly resemble in purpose the modern scientific journal. But what was important about these new commercial monthly magazines devoted to science that started to be produced in the 1790s, titles like the Philosophical Magazine, which some of you will know is still running, the Journal of Natural Philosophy, Chemistry and the Arts. What was important about them was the way that they exploited a growing market for print so that they could build up communities of readers who used the new scientific journals to learn, to communicate and to interact. The Journal of Natural Philosophy is a good example. It was founded by William Nicholson, a scientific schoolmaster and author who, for a while, had been a commercial agent for the potter, Josiah Wedgwood. And it promised to busy men who couldn't afford to keep up with the expensive transactions of learned societies like this, it promised them an account of the present state, new publications and discoveries in natural philosophy, chemistry and the arts, and in the various departments of manufacturing industry. These same busy, practical men, the manufacturers and inventors of Britain's burgeoning industrialisation, were also invited to contribute their findings alongside acknowledged philosophers, the genteel fellows of learned societies. So with its monthly schedule, the magazine offered an opportunity for rapid interchange between a very diverse group of people on such rapidly changing subjects as electrochemistry. And with Nicholson himself, the editor himself, active in electrochemical researches, the Journal of Natural Philosophy became pivotal in the development of this new scientific field in a way that just couldn't have happened without this new kind of periodical. To a large extent, this new development actually predated the technological changes that we've been exploring. But that's not a problem, because it was precisely the growing market for print in the late 18th century, which itself was spawned by the growing demand for books and periodicals and newspapers among the burgeoning provincial manufacturing towns with their new middling sort. It was precisely that growing market that prompted the technological changes that then facilitated its expansion. And as we run the story forward into the 19th century, an ever-increasing array of scientific periodicals was produced, contributing significantly to the construction and control of scientific communities in a rich variety of ways. Such developments were simply unsupportable without the increased capacity for communication that came with the mechanisation of the book trade. So that's one example. Here's another one. The scientific school book. It seems unthinkable that the scientific school book should be little more than a couple of 100 years old, but so it is. In the middle of the 18th century, advanced schooling in Britain was still dominated by the classically oriented curriculum of the grammar schools. Only thereafter were growing numbers of private academies established, notably for the education of the sons, particularly the sons of the growing ranks of merchants and manufacturers. They wanted an education in modern subjects like modern languages, geography, history, natural philosophy, what we think of as science. And these were included. In this context, some scientific books for the use of schools were introduced, but it was only in the years after 1800 that this man here, Richard Phillips, put the production of scientific school books on a new footing. Over the space of the first decade of the century, he developed a suite of school books from modern schools, with scientific ones prominently included. According to an arithmetical problem that he set in one of his mathematical school books, Phillips got printed for various books between 1798 and 1808 as many sheets of paper as would, if joined together, extend round the world. He then gave some sizes and asked the school children to work out how many sheets that must be. Well, I can tell you, it equates to more than 75 million printed sheets. That is enough to make 6 million moderately sized 200-page volumes. Phillips's new books obviously sold well. They also had a very particular style, linked to his sense of the market. They were made up of a series of numbered assertions, which, he advised, students should be set to learn by rote before being tested on their knowledge using supplied questions. So in Phillips's new textbooks, a scientific education was all about the learning of facts. I don't know why Dickens' character, Mr. Gradgrind, has suddenly come to mind. Facts. But the point is that Phillips's books went a long way to developing a new market for scientific school books, and the huge industry in schooling that followed continued in many ways this focus on the acquisition of facts. Something, of course, which Ludwig Fleck was very aware of. So that's the scientific school book. My third example, a third kind of publication made possible by the industrialisation of print, was the popular science book. Popular science is another thing that it's easy to imagine must always have existed. But the phrase only began to be used in English in the 1810s, and that's because it refers to a new kind of industrial product aimed at the kind of broad audience that was newly possible with the mechanisation of the book trade. This is a case in point. This is a 6-penny treatise on pneumatics, produced by the Society for the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge in 1828. This wonderfully named society used all the new techniques of the industrial age: steam presses, machine-made paper, stereotyping, edition binding, to produce works on the sciences that even workers could buy. So why did the emergence of this notion of popular science, designed in its price and mode of address to reach a wide audience, why did it matter for the history of Victorian science? Well, once again, as with all these new forms, the innovation involved developing new ways of communicating about the sciences. How is one to write for a popular audience? Such audiences were presumed to want to know what the sciences amounted to rather than the detail, give them perhaps something about the history and methods of the science, an overview and synthesis of its key findings, a sense of how it impinges on human concerns. And writing about science in such a mode allowed for new kinds of claims to be made and new kinds of connections, which ultimately redounded on the specialist science. In his book, Victorian Sensation, science historian James Secord has shown just how important this process could be. Secord's book relates to the anonymous evolutionary bestseller of 1844, Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation. In fact, the book was written by the Edinburgh publisher, Robert Chambers, a man described as the essayist of the middle classes. Chambers put together recent work on a number of sciences to provide a breathtaking synthetic account of cosmic evolution from the universe through the earth, plants, animals, humans. And Secord shows convincingly that it was this popular science book, with its different way of thinking about how to communicate the sciences, scorned as it was by most of the scientific specialists, it was this book, much more than Darwin's later book, The Origin of Species, which put evolutionary ideas at the heart of Victorian culture. His book, Secord says, recasts the Darwinian revolution as an episode in the industrialization of communication and the transformation of reading audiences. So there could hardly be a more compelling case for the importance for the sciences of the reconfiguration of communication brought about by the mechanization of the book trade in the 19th century. And I hope that these three examples, scientific journals, school books, popular science, have served to convince you how much changes in communication technology have surprisingly had a significant role to play in the making of the modern sciences. But I don't want to leave the question there. While printing technology has mattered on this big canvas in making possible new kinds of publications and new kinds of communication with all that that entails, it's also a matter of it also mattered on a more nuts and bolts kind of level. In short, it's not just a question of how and with whom you can communicate, but also a question of just what you can, practically speaking, and economically speaking, manage to put on a printed page. And in this final part of the lecture, we're just going to give you a couple of examples to illuminate this point. First of all, Konstantin is going to look at the practical questions underlying the adoption of the structural formulae that are so iconic in modern chemistry. And then I'll briefly introduce the technologies of illustration, pointing up how important the practicalities of those technologies were in the development of disciplines such as geology. So at this point, I hand back to Konstantin.
Thank you. Okay, can you hear me? Good. So I will now briefly speak on why printing history matters to the history of chemistry by demonstrating how printing shaped the way we think about chemistry and what actually counts today as chemical knowledge. And I'm pretty sure you will all know or will recognize the chemical text just by looking at the page for a very obvious reason. And let's put it to the test. So when you see that, you know it's about chemistry. Quite obviously. Because you will recognize this very strong, expressive, unmistakable visual language used in chemistry today. And these are just recent examples of structure formulae. The left one is from a journal article from 2009, and you see different bits of the DNA molecule, actually modified bits of the DNA molecule. And here, on these two slides, you can see basically structural formula of glucose molecules. And I took the liberty to photograph these from a textbook. So I actually used the same textbook here to learn about chemistry during my undergraduate degree. And yes, so this is what the formula looked today, or until, well, a few years ago, but it still looks today the same way. And it is certainly true that the visual appearance of those formula was closely connected to a specific theoretical development in chemistry, namely the introduction of a new chemical theory in the last third of the 19th century, and the theory is called the theory of chemical structure, and hence the formula soon came to be known, as I already said, as structural formula. Yet in my part today I would like to show you that there's also a very practical reason for why the formula looked the way they do today, and that reason is that those symbols were for a very long time typeset by hand by experienced and highly skilled compositors. Or put another way, the visual language of modern chemistry owes its characteristics to 19th century print technology and the men in charge of typesetting those formula. So have another look at those few formula here. So as you can see, the formula is made up of a small number of geometric objects, that is some letters, numerals, and basically lines. And they all follow a very basic recipe, right? So you have letters, in this case the C stands for carbon, the O stands for oxygen, the H stands for hydrogen. And you have lines between them. And these lines symbolize the chemical bonds between the atoms. So there's a chemical bond between the two C's here, for example, another chemical bond between the carbon and the hydrogen, and so on. And yeah, and you get the chemical formula or the structural formula of the glucose molecule. And you can then basically use the same ingredients to construct larger and other chemical formula, and basically you have very little restrictions. So you can just go up in size and have like a large formula like that, which will probably cover up most of a journal page. Going back 150 years, we can see that there is also there's almost no difference between chemical formula today and those from the late 1860s. That is when the first line and letter formula, as they prefer to call them for obvious reasons, made their first appearance. The formula used around 1870 looked like this. And you see they're almost identical to those I just showed you before. So very little difference. So the one on top here is from 1870, and this is sulfuric acid. Then this is from a journal article, 1875. Then we have different acids down here, also from a journal article from 1870. And this is the famous benzene formula from 1872. So, yes, and basically the lines and letters and the numerals go back to the way in which the formula got printed in the 19th century. And in fact, those parts were the basic parts of the compositor's tool. So, do not be deceived though, because what looks like a simple diagram on the printed page was in fact a very challenging piece of work. And although movable type had been used before to print other kinds of chemical formula, the emergence of line and letter formula, or structural formula, in the 1860s presented printmakers with a whole range of new challenges. And the ultimate challenge was basically the accurate arrangement of spacing material to justify the formula so that it made a neat and coherent appearance on the page. And this scheme is from a printer's manual, which shows how difficult it is to arrange these kinds of pieces as spacing material to render such a small chemical formula as this one. And the black bits, well, yeah, basically everything here on that scheme represents tiny little pieces like this. They come in different sizes, but still they're very small, and you need to puzzle them together to print a simple formula like this. And this is basically a formula which will fit on the composing stick, and it's still it's a serious challenge to pick those little bits bits and pieces to arrange them that the whole thing fits together, and then to fix it on the form, as John mentioned earlier. And you need to imagine that if you make one small mistake, if one of your spacing pieces, let's say a tiny piece like that, or there are even smaller ones, if they don't fit, and you try to fix it on the form, the whole thing will fall apart. And now imagine setting a formula like this. So that will take you a very long time to do. So you now can basically imagine how much work went into setting formula like that. And the largest of work required to put the formula on the page was also reflected in the relatively high printing costs. So, just to illustrate, a report of the British Association for the Advancement of Science from 1875 states that the composition of mathematical matter, which was very similar to the composition of chemical matter, quote, may in general be estimated at 3 times that of ordinary or plain matter. So, setting chemical formula was 3 times the costs of setting, basically plain text, like a novel, for example. And it is for this reason that printers and editors developed various strategies to reduce the amount of work required to typeset the space-consuming formula. So, by way of illustration, printer manuals from the early 1900s show that printers in Britain, Germany, and other European countries developed specific typographical conventions in order to streamline composition. They made very precise instructions what point size to use and what spacing material is best, and how to basically lay out your equipment to be able to set the formula quickly and efficiently. And at the same time, editors of scientific journals, such as the Journal of the Chemical Society, introduced instructions which required authors to use a specific kind of short notation to reduce the space covered by chemical diagrams, and thus to reduce the cost of labor of setting those diagrams. But despite all this, types of diagrams still proved to be much cheaper than diagrams made from, let's say, woodcuts or other illustration techniques. And using standard typographical equipment, more and more compositors gradually learned to produce the formula in their local printing workshop. So basically, our case of type here should be enough to set at least a simple chemical formula. So this allows the formula then to circulate in printed form between different countries, markets, and audiences, and thus gradually to become the standard visual language of chemistry. However, it is also important to point out that this did not happen immediately, and took in fact several decades until line and letter formula were universally accepted and used by all chemists, which was only around the late 1880s. And this was gradually happening. The diagrams also acquired new meanings and functions. Chemists began to use the diagrams not only to communicate the theoretical interpretations of chemical reactions, but also with more and more confidence to describe the physical reality of the unobservable realm of atoms and molecules. And the diagrams thereby made an essential contribution to the establishment of the field of stereochemistry, which is the study of the spatial position of atoms in the molecule. Or put differently, we can say that stereochemistry would not have developed in the same way without the essential contribution of line and letter formula as a way to reason about the spatial arrangement of atoms. So just to conclude my part here, I hope that by getting a brief insight into the fascinating story I just tried to lay out, you could see how print technology played a major part in the communication of chemical knowledge, as well as open new avenues of research, and as seen in the case of stereochemistry, and to see how technology helped to shape what counts today as chemical knowledge and chemical language. And now I will hand over to John, who will speak on illustration techniques in geology.
Thank you, Konstantin. So that's one way in which the practicalities of print technology have been beginning in the making of the modern sciences, the iconic formalism of chemistry. Another aspect of the story relates to the use of even more complex visual representations in the science of geology. In a classic study, historian of geology Martin Rudwick explored the key role that the, as he put it, emergence of a visual language played in the development of the newly emerging discipline of geology in the late 18th and early 19th century. And he analysed how different kinds of illustrations, including maps and transverse sections and landscape views were key in establishing the theoretical perspectives and the methodological approaches in this fledgling science. But Professor Ruddick was the first to acknowledge that these developments depended on an underlying story of rapidly changing illustrative technologies. At the end of the 18th century, the only illustrative technology available to the geologists was the intaglio plate. That is, this involved using a thin copper plate in which marks were cut by engraving or etching or stippling or mezzotinting, various techniques. And then ink was applied to the marks and wiped off the rest of the surface. And the specialist printer, here we have a specialist printer, could put the plate through a roller press which would lift the ink out onto the paper. But this was a really expensive process. It involved a highly skilled engraver, and the finished image had to appear on a separate sheet from the rest of the text. The process was so expensive that when the newly founded Geological Society of London began to issue transactions in 1811, the use of illustrations nearly bankrupted it. Illustrations were clearly considered to be very important, so the Society invested huge sums in large numbers of intaglio plates like this one, based on Gideon Mantell's drawings of plesiosaur. But within 10 years, with 5 volumes in print, the Society was on the verge of bankruptcy, and it had to retrench, and the key part of the way in which it did that was to make its illustrations cheaper. And here, a new technology, lithography, came to its aid, where intaglio plates involved ink going into these marks cut into the plate. Lithography was a chemical process. It was developed in the early 19th century in Bavaria, and it used a particular kind of fine limestone onto which waxy marks were applied, and then you would wet the stone, and when the ink was then applied to the stone, it would only adhere to the waxy marks, and you could then put a piece of paper on and press it to the surface, and that would take up the ink. And here is a lithographic stone with an image on it. Not only was this new technology much cheaper, it was also more accessible to skilled artists, and it also offered some remarkable graphic qualities, especially a sense of texture, which was especially attractive to the geologists. So here we have another image from a later volume of the Geological Society Transactions, also plesiosaur bones, also drawn by Gideon Mantell, but this time there's a much stronger sense of texture from the lithographic representation. Leading geologist Charles Lyell responded to the Geological Society's new initiative with rapturous applause. He said, "This art, so strongly recommended by its superior cheapness, may exert a favourable influence on the future progress of science, and particularly on natural history, which has always been retarded by the unavoidable expense of engraving." So here we have a technology which is making quite a difference as this science begins to explore the possibilities of visual representation. In the course of time, lithography was actually supplanted by the development of high-quality wood engraving, which wasn't just cheaper again, but actually it also allowed images to be printed next to the text, because it involved wood blocks in which the white areas were cut away, so that you were left with a relief surface that could be printed next to the type. And this high-quality engraving began to be developed by Thomas Bewick at the end of the 18th century, and commentators readily agreed that it was, there's some examples of wood blocks which you can see at the front here. It was widely agreed that it was especially valuable in conveying a sense of the character of animals. Here is Bewick's squirrel, a wood engraving, and here is another squirrel from contemporary work done on the copper plate, and I think you'll acknowledge that there's a much stronger sense of character in Bewick's squirrel. But as the demand for plentiful and cheap illustrations grew in the sciences, geologists found that they could use wood engraving to serve their purposes as well. So these are some illustrations using wood engraving from the proceedings of the Geological Society. As the demand for, technological developments were obviously therefore key to the development of the visual language for the new geological science in the early 19th century, just as the development of that language was key to the development of the science itself. And as we've seen so often in these lectures, for all that we like to think of the sciences as cerebral activities, removed from financial concerns, they do so often come down to the practicalities of objects in the world, what I've called here the brass tacks, and to how much they cost. Okay, so we need to bring things to a close. And in the course of this lecture, I hope that we've convinced you that the Victorian printing press had an important role in the making of the modern sciences. Above all, with the changes that it permitted in the types of audiences and publications, but also it had implications for what could be represented on a page visually. And that matters in the sciences. But perhaps before we close, we should turn to the present and the consequences for the sciences of the transformation of communication through which we're living, namely the rise of the internet. Many academics have addressed themselves to this question, but I'm going to use an example, a recent blog post by Scott McLeod, Associate Professor of Education Administration at Iowa State University, who asks, so what do I think the new academic publishing paradigm might look like? And he answers, scholarship will be more open. Rather than being locked down by academic publishers, future scholarship will be available to all who are interested. Scholarship will be more available. Not only will more articles be publicly accessible, they also will be easier to find. Academia will require a different conceptualization of what constitutes scholarship. Right now, most printed journals require the authors follow certain writing, structural, formatting, and criterion citation conventions, and that, he says, will change. Academia will require a different conceptualization of peer review. An article literally can be made available to everyone worldwide. What constitutes appropriate review? Academia will require a different conceptualization of quality. Rather than an article's worthiness being judged by the opinions of a few experts, it may be judged by the number of page visits, or number of comments, or number of trackback links, or its usage by and impact upon practitioners. Well, I think I detect some of you sort of shuffling slightly in your seats at that particular vision of the future of scholarship or of science. But whether Professor McLeod is right or not in his vision of the future, there can be no question that the changes in the technology of communication that we're currently living through will have far-reaching consequences for the remaking of modern science, just as the developments of 19th century printing had a surprising role in the making of modern science. Thank you.
Thank you.